Welcome to Christ Word, where everyday lives meet the light of God's Word. Here, we don't preach. We tell stories. Moments of doubt, turning points, quiet revelations, all woven with raw emotion and unshakable faith. You're not just listening to someone else's journey. You might just find your own reflection in it. And maybe, just maybe, by the end, you'll discover the answer you've been searching for. One day, in the heart of a bustling city, a man named John stood among the crowd, feeling lost and isolated. He didn't know why he felt empty inside, even though everything around him seemed perfect. He had a stable job, friends, a family, but within, he couldn't escape the feeling of being directionless. John had once been a man full of ambition. He wanted everything society deemed valuable: money, fame, success. But after achieving everything he thought he wanted, he realized none of it brought him true happiness. Every day, he felt as though he was walking down a path with no end. Everything around him was just a shell, and deep inside, there was a void. Then, as if by fate, John came across a phrase he had once heard but never paid attention to: "Don't worry, trust in God." Those words, simple yet profound, stirred within him a curiosity he hadn't felt in a long time. He couldn't stop thinking about the teachings of Christ, about faith, and about how one could live a meaningful life. On restless nights, John began reading the Bible. He started studying God's words and teachings. But the more he learned, the more confused he became. How could he believe in something he couldn't see? How could he live by values in a society where everything seemed corrupted by greed, dishonesty, and selfishness? What would happen when someone like John, who had once given up and lost faith in everything, began his journey of rediscovery? Could he overcome the challenges and live truthfully to his beliefs? Everything was still uncertain. But there was one thing John knew for sure: he would never go back to his old ways, not even a single step. John hadn't found the answer to all his questions yet, but one thing he knew was that every day he felt a small change within. A change so subtle, yet enough to make him believe that he was headed in the right direction. And once again, he returned to the words of Christ: "Trust in the Lord, and He will guide you." It was then that John realized this journey wasn't a race to find life's purpose, but a journey from the inside out, from the soul to actions. And in this journey, he began to find what he truly needed, not from the outside world, but from within himself. But would John have the strength to continue this path when the world around him kept turning, full of constant challenges and temptations? His story was just beginning, and the big questions were still waiting for him. What would John do next? What difficulties would he face on his journey to rediscover his faith in a world full of relentless challenges? John sat in his apartment late one night, staring at the Bible in front of him. He had read the same passage several times, but tonight, the words felt different. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding," it said. He ran his fingers over the pages, as if the words could somehow give him the answers he was searching for. In his past life, John had always relied on his own intellect, his abilities, and his ambition. He had succeeded in the ways the world measured success. But now, those same accomplishments felt hollow. What did it mean to trust in the Lord? And how could he do that in a world that seemed so unforgiving, so driven by individualism and competition? He had no answers, only more questions. That night, as John pondered the scriptures, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something. A new chapter, a new understanding of life, but the path ahead felt uncertain. Could he really live according to the teachings of Christ in a world where truth and integrity seemed to be in short supply? The next morning, John decided to take a walk. The city was waking up, the streets bustling with the usual early morning rush. But John wasn't in a hurry. He walked slowly, observing the people around him. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they, too, were searching for something. Was it the same emptiness he felt inside? Was there more to life than the daily grind, the constant pursuit of achievement? As he walked, he found himself at a small park. It was quiet, the trees standing tall and steady, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. John sat on a bench, taking in the peacefulness around him. And as he sat there, something inside him shifted. He realized that trusting in the Lord didn't mean having all the answers. It didn't mean understanding everything about life or the world around him. It meant surrendering his need to control every aspect of his existence. John thought about his past, the years spent chasing success, the times he had neglected relationships, ignored his inner peace, and sought fulfillment in all the wrong places. He remembered the countless hours he'd spent in meetings, focused on climbing the corporate ladder, convincing himself that achieving more was the key to happiness. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He closed his eyes and whispered a simple prayer, "God, show me the way." It wasn't a grand prayer, just a humble request. But it felt different. For the first time, John felt like he wasn't trying to force something to happen. He was letting go. The weeks that followed were not easy. John faced many challenges as he tried to live according to his new understanding. At work, his colleagues continued to play the same game, pushing for promotions, competing with each other, measuring success by the size of their paychecks and titles. John felt out of place. There were moments when he was tempted to fall back into old patterns, to buy into the idea that success was the ultimate goal, but something inside him told him to stay true to his newfound faith. One afternoon, as he was leaving the office, John ran into a former colleague named Sarah. She had always been one of the more ambitious people in the office, always striving to climb higher, get ahead, no matter the cost. John had always admired her drive, but now, he saw something different in her eyes. She seemed weary, as if the weight of her own ambitions had finally taken a toll. "John, it's been a while," Sarah said, smiling but with an edge of exhaustion in her voice. "Yeah, it's been too long," John replied, offering a genuine smile in return. "How have you been?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Honestly, I'm tired. I thought I had everything figured out. The promotions, the money, the lifestyle, but it's not enough. I don't know what I'm chasing anymore." John's heart went out to her. He could see the same emptiness in her that he had once felt. It was in the way she spoke, the way her eyes darted around as if searching for something, anything, to fill the void. "Have you ever thought about slowing down?" John asked, almost instinctively. Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Slowing down? What do you mean?" John hesitated, then said, "I've been trying to live differently. To stop chasing things that don't really matter. I've started reading the Bible, learning about faith. It's made me realize that there's more to life than the endless race for success. I think I've been looking for peace in all the wrong places." Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Then she shook her head, almost laughing. "John, you're talking about faith. I don't know if that's for me. I've spent so much of my life fighting to get ahead. How do you just let go of all that?" John smiled softly, thinking about his own journey. "I don't have all the answers, Sarah. But what I do know is that when I started trusting in God, when I let go of my need to control everything, I felt a sense of peace. It's not always easy, but I believe it's worth it." Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at him, as if weighing his words carefully. Eventually, she sighed and nodded. "Maybe there's something to what you're saying. Maybe I do need to change my perspective. I'll think about it." John knew that his conversation with Sarah hadn't changed everything for her. He didn't expect it to. But it had been a moment of connection, a chance to share his journey, to offer a glimpse of hope in a world that often felt hopeless. As he walked home that evening, John felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't because everything was perfect or because he had all the answers. It was because, for the first time in a long while, he was living with intention. He was living with faith. And that made all the difference. But there was still so much to learn. The path ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. John knew that faith wasn't a one-time choice, it was a daily commitment, a constant journey of growth. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was ready to face it, step by step, trusting that God would guide him along the way. John's life was beginning to look different, but the changes weren't always smooth. Every day felt like a battle between his old self and the person he was becoming. He had started living with faith, but living out that faith in a world that didn't always understand or support it was challenging. At work, the pressure to keep climbing the corporate ladder never ceased. His colleagues were relentless, constantly striving for the next promotion, the next big deal, the next achievement. It was hard to ignore the pull of ambition, especially when the reward seemed so tangible, so close. The success was right there, just within reach, and yet John found himself less and less interested in it. His mind would drift to the moments when he felt at peace, the early morning walks in the park, the quiet evenings spent reading the Bible, the slow but steady changes happening within him. But even as his soul was finding peace, the world around him was still pressing forward with its noise and its expectations. One particular day, John received a call from his boss, who invited him to a lunch meeting to discuss an important promotion. The position came with more responsibility, a higher salary, and a chance to make a bigger impact on the company. It seemed like the perfect opportunity, the kind of opportunity John would have jumped at before. But as he sat down for the meeting, the words felt different. His boss spoke about the challenges ahead, the competition, the long hours. And somewhere between the numbers and the titles, John began to feel a familiar tightness in his chest. This wasn't the kind of success he was looking for anymore. It wasn't what he wanted. "John," his boss said, looking at him expectantly. "This is your chance. You've worked hard for this. It's everything you've wanted." John smiled, but there was no excitement in his heart. He had worked hard, yes. But had it really been for the right reasons? He could already see himself locked in the same endless cycle of chasing more, doing more, always wanting more. "I appreciate the offer," John began slowly, "but I'm not sure this is the path I want to take anymore." His boss raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "What do you mean?" "This is your time, John. You've earned it." John paused, thinking for a moment. He could feel the weight of the decision, but there was also a deep sense of clarity that had been missing for so long. He wasn't sure what his future looked like, but he knew it wasn't going to be shaped by titles or paychecks anymore. "I've been thinking a lot lately," John continued, his voice steady. "And I've come to realize that success isn't just about moving up in the company. It's about finding peace in what you do, and living with integrity." His boss looked at him, unsure of how to respond. "You know, John, you're a good guy. But you have to understand, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Don't you want to make something of yourself?" John took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the years he'd spent chasing the same dream. The dream of climbing higher, faster, stronger. But now, it all felt empty. "I've already made something of myself," he said softly. "I've learned that what matters most is not how much I have or how high I climb, but how I live and treat others. It's about living with purpose, not just profit." The conversation didn't last much longer. His boss seemed perplexed, even disappointed, but John felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. As he left the meeting, he was unsure of what would come next. Would this decision cost him? Would it set him back? He didn't know. But he did know one thing: for the first time, he was living true to his values. He was no longer making decisions based on external pressure or superficial goals. His focus had shifted. And that shift was everything. In the following weeks, John felt an increasing sense of inner peace. It wasn't that the world around him had become easier. On the contrary, the challenges seemed to grow. People still asked him why he wasn't chasing promotions, why he wasn't pushing harder. Some even tried to convince him that he was missing out on opportunities. But John wasn't swayed by their opinions anymore. He found solace in the small moments, sharing dinner with friends who understood him, walking through the city streets and noticing the beauty in everyday things, offering a helping hand to a colleague in need. He began to realize that these small acts, these moments of connection, were where true fulfillment came from. It wasn't in the accolades or the high-paying jobs, it was in the way he treated people, the way he showed up for them, and the way he lived his life with integrity. But it wasn't always easy. One evening, as John sat in his apartment reflecting on the days that had passed, he found himself questioning everything once again. What if this was all for nothing? What if he was just fooling himself, thinking that living with faith could make a real difference in the world? And then, as if in response, he opened his Bible once more. This time, his eyes landed on a verse he had read many times before, but it felt different now. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." John let the words sink in. In that moment, he realized that faith wasn't about having everything figured out. It wasn't about being perfect or always knowing what the next step was. It was about trusting that, no matter what happened, he was being led towards something greater than himself. He wasn't alone on this journey. God was with him, guiding him every step of the way, even in moments of doubt. That was the power of faith, not perfection, but trust. And for John, that was enough. But the journey was far from over. The next chapter awaited him, and though he couldn't see it yet, he was ready to take that next step with faith in his heart, knowing that, with God's guidance, he would continue to find his way. John's journey was far from easy, but with each step, he felt the weight of the world lifting just a little bit more. There were days when the doubts crept back in, whispering that maybe he had made a mistake. The world around him was moving forward, his peers were advancing in their careers, buying new homes, acquiring more possessions. It was tempting to look at their success and wonder if he had given up too soon. One afternoon, as he sat in his favorite cafe, he overheard a conversation between two friends. They were discussing a recent promotion one of them had received. The excitement in their voices was palpable as they talked about the perks of the new role, the prestige, and the financial rewards. John couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. He remembered what it felt like to be in that position, to feel like every achievement was a step closer to a more fulfilling life. But now, he wasn't sure. His phone buzzed with a notification, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from his old boss. "John, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to check in. I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I admire the decision you made. But if you ever change your mind, the promotion is still on the table." John stared at the message, his finger hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to accept. It was easy. It was familiar. The job was secure, the money was guaranteed, and he wouldn't have to worry about the uncertainty of the future. But something inside him resisted. He had worked hard for this new path, this new life. He had fought through his own doubts and fears to get here. And he wasn't willing to give it up. He put the phone down, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. The streets were filled with people, each on their own journey, each facing their own battles. And in that moment, John realized that his journey wasn't about comparing himself to others. It wasn't about whether he had the same things or the same success. It was about finding peace and purpose in what he was doing now, in the choices he was making for himself. As he walked home that evening, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known before. It wasn't that life had become easier. There were still challenges, still moments when he felt overwhelmed by the demands of the world around him. But he no longer felt like he was fighting against it. He had started to live with intention, and that made all the difference. The next day, John received another message, this time, from Sarah, the colleague he had spoken with months ago. She had reached out to him after their last conversation and mentioned that she had started exploring faith as well. They met for coffee that afternoon, and as Sarah shared her own struggles and doubts, John listened with empathy and understanding. "I've been trying to find peace, John," Sarah said, her voice quiet but determined. "I've been chasing success my whole life, but it doesn't fill the emptiness. I don't know where to start. Everything feels so overwhelming. John nodded, thinking about his own journey. It's hard. I know that. But faith isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting that, even in the confusion, there's a purpose to everything we go through. It's about letting go of the need to control it all. Sarah looked thoughtful. I'm starting to see that. It's just hard to trust something I can't see, you know. John smiled gently. I get it. But sometimes, faith is about taking that first step, even when we don't have all the answers. I don't have it all figured out either. But I'm learning that trusting God, even when things don't make sense, is the only way to find peace. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, John. I think I needed to hear that. As they parted ways, John felt a quiet joy in his heart. He hadn't solved Sarah's problems or given her all the answers, but he had shared his journey with her, and that was enough. It was in these small moments of connection, these conversations where faith and hope were shared, that he saw the true power of living with integrity and purpose. That evening, as John sat in his apartment, reflecting on the day, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't because everything was perfect. It wasn't because the world had suddenly become easier. It was because he had found something deeper than success, deeper than wealth, and deeper than personal achievement. He had found peace in living according to his values. In the quiet moments of his life, when the world slowed down, John found himself praying more often. Simple prayers, nothing elaborate, just conversations with God. Thank you for today, he would say. Help me be the person I'm meant to be. Guide me on this path. He realized that living by faith wasn't about making everything perfect. It wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about staying true to his values, trusting that God would guide him through the storms, and finding contentment in the small, everyday moments. But even with all the progress he had made, John knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments when he would question his decisions. But he no longer feared the unknown. He had learned to trust, and that trust would carry him forward, no matter what came his way. As John closed his eyes that night, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly where this journey would take him. But he knew one thing for sure, he was no longer walking alone. The days following his decision to embrace faith were not easy, but John had begun to feel a quiet strength growing inside him, something he hadn't felt before. Life wasn't magically perfect, but it was different. He was learning to trust, to let go of the need to control every aspect of his life, and to embrace the uncertainty that came with stepping out in faith. At work, things seemed to continue as they always had, but John saw them through a new lens. The office buzzed with the same energy, competitive, ambitious, driven, but he didn't feel compelled to participate in the same way he once had. It was as if he had detached from the endless chase for status and wealth. Instead, he started approaching his work with a new sense of purpose. He focused on doing his best, not for the accolades or the promotions, but because it was what felt right. He would complete tasks with integrity, offer help to others without expecting anything in return, and choose honesty even when it was the harder path. It wasn't always easy. Some colleagues questioned his quieter demeanor, and others saw his lack of ambition as a weakness, but John didn't mind. He was finally at peace with who he was becoming. It was during a particularly challenging week at work that John had a conversation that would change everything. He had been feeling overwhelmed, balancing the expectations of his job with his desire to live a life of faith. One of his colleagues, Alex, had noticed that John seemed distracted, and they ended up sitting down for a coffee break. "John, you've seemed different lately," Alex said, eyes narrowing in curiosity. "What's going on?" John hesitated. There had been moments when he had thought about sharing his journey with others, but it never felt quite right. Now, though, he felt a tug in his heart to open up. "I've been changing," John said, slowly, trying to find the words. "I've been working on my faith. I'm trying to live differently, with more integrity and purpose." Alex looked at him, puzzled. What do you mean, working on your faith? I mean, you've always been a good guy, but this sounds different. John took a deep breath. I've been reading the Bible. I've been learning about trusting in God, letting go of the need to control everything, and living with purpose beyond just career success. For a long time, I thought my life was about climbing the ladder, achieving more. But now, I've realized that true fulfillment comes from living with values that align with my faith, not just ambition. Alex stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know, man. I'm all for self-improvement and all, but faith? That's a lot to take in. John nodded. He had expected that reaction. He wasn't trying to convince Alex to believe what he believed. He was simply sharing his journey. I get it. It's not easy to understand. But for me, it's been about peace, about finding my center. It's about trusting that there's a purpose to everything, even when I don't have all the answers. Alex didn't say much after that. He took another sip of his coffee, clearly processing what John had said. I don't know if I'm there yet, Alex muttered, but it sounds like you found something important. That was the moment when John realized that living his faith wasn't just about his own journey. It was about sharing that journey with others, letting his actions speak louder than his words. He wasn't going to force his beliefs on anyone, but if his way of living inspired even one person to reconsider their path, that would be enough. As the weeks went on, John continued to find moments of quiet reflection, moments where he felt truly connected to God. In the stillness of his apartment, after a long day, he would sit with the Bible and simply ask, God, what would you have me do? And every time, he felt the gentle nudges toward kindness, patience, and understanding. He began to see the people around him in a new light, his colleagues, his friends, even strangers, each one a part of a bigger story, each one deserving of empathy and respect. But even as John felt more at peace, there were still moments of doubt. He found himself questioning his purpose, wondering if he was making the right choices. He missed the stability of his old life at times, the security that came with climbing the corporate ladder, with knowing exactly what was expected of him. But whenever those doubts crept in, he returned to what he knew to be true, that living with faith was about trusting the journey, even when it was unclear. It was about trusting that God would guide him, even in the moments when he felt lost. One evening, after a particularly trying day at work, John sat down on the couch, exhausted. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. She had texted him a simple question: how do you keep going when it feels like nothing is changing? John thought for a moment before typing his response. It's hard. I won't lie. But I keep going because I believe that God is with me, even in the tough times. I'm not perfect, but I know that living with faith is the best way forward. And even when I don't see the results right away, I trust that they're coming. He paused before adding, sometimes, all we can do is keep trusting and keep living with integrity. Everything else will follow. The next morning, Sarah replied with a simple, thank you. I think I needed to hear that. John smiled to himself. It wasn't the first time someone had reached out to him for advice, but it was a reminder that, even in his moments of doubt, his journey was having an impact on others. Living with faith wasn't just about John, it was about everyone around him, too. In the months that followed, John's life continued to evolve. The path wasn't always easy, and there were days when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. But with each step, he felt more aligned with his values, more at peace with who he was. He realized that, while the world would continue to move forward with its noise and its pressure, he didn't have to be swept up in it. He had the power to choose his path, and he had chosen faith. And as he stood at the edge of another crossroads, John knew one thing for sure: he was no longer afraid. He had found his purpose, and no matter what came next, he would face it with trust and courage, knowing that God was guiding him every step of the way. John's journey had transformed him in ways he never could have predicted. The uncertainty that had once paralyzed him had become a source of strength. Each day, he was learning to trust more, to let go of control, and to embrace the unknown with faith. His choices were no longer driven by what the world expected of him, but by a deeper sense of purpose, a purpose that aligned with the values he had found through his faith. Despite the peace he felt, there were still moments when the weight of the world seemed heavy. He had been living in a way that was aligned with his beliefs, but the external pressures never stopped. People around him were still moving forward in their careers, still chasing after the same goals that had once consumed him. Friends and family sometimes questioned his decisions, wondering if he was truly making the right choice by not striving for higher positions, more wealth, and the traditional markers of success. One afternoon, as he sat in a quiet cafe, he received a call from his father, someone who had always pushed him to be the best, to never settle for less. "John," his father's voice came through the phone, "I've been hearing some things. I know you've been making some changes in your life, but are you sure you're on the right path? You've always had so much potential. Why settle for less?" John took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. His father's voice always carried a weight of expectation that had been hard to shake off. He loved his father, but he also knew that his perspective on success wasn't the same as his own anymore. "Dad, I'm not settling," John said quietly. "I'm just choosing a different kind of success. It's not about titles or money anymore. It's about living with integrity, about making choices that align with my faith. I know it doesn't look the way you want it to, but I'm at peace with it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," his father finally said, his tone softer. "But I worry about you. This world is competitive. People don't wait for you to figure it out." "I know," John replied. "But I've realized something. I can't live my life based on other people's expectations. I have to live it based on what feels right in my heart. And right now, this is what feels right." His father didn't say much more. But John could hear the unspoken concern in his voice, the silent wish that John would return to the path of conventional success. After the call, John sat back in his chair, looking out the window at the busy street. The world continued to move, people rushing by, everyone caught in their own pursuits. And for a moment, John felt the pull of his old life, the life that had been dictated by the pursuit of success and recognition. He questioned whether he had truly made the right choice. But then, as he sat there, something inside him shifted. He remembered why he had chosen this path. It wasn't about rejecting success or ambition. It was about redefining success. For him, true success was not found in external achievements, but in living with honesty, kindness, and faith. He had been walking a path of growth, of self-discovery, and although it hadn't been easy, it was his path. And it was the one that felt truest to who he was becoming. That evening, John took a walk through the park, the place where he had begun to connect with his faith. As he walked along the path, he saw families gathered together, people reading, laughing, and simply being. The peace that came from these simple moments was more than he had ever found in his old life. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated, but it was real. It was the life he was creating for himself. He continued his walk, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude for everything he had learned, for the growth he had experienced, for the peace that was now present in his heart. There was still so much to discover, so many challenges ahead, but John knew he was no longer afraid. The journey of faith wasn't about avoiding difficulties, it was about facing them with trust in God and the strength to move forward, even when the way seemed unclear. As he reached the end of the park, a familiar voice called out to him. It was Sarah, the colleague he had shared his journey with months ago. She was sitting on a bench, her face thoughtful, a Bible resting in her hands. "John," she called softly as he approached, "I've been reading the Bible like you suggested. I'm still not sure about everything, but I feel different. I feel like I'm starting to understand." John smiled and sat next to her. "I'm glad to hear that, Sarah. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that you're on the right path, even when you don't have it all figured out. And it's okay not to have all the answers right away." Sarah nodded. "I've been struggling with that. I think I've been looking for quick fixes, wanting everything to change overnight. But maybe it's about taking it one day at a time. Exactly, John said. One step at a time. Just keep trusting, and take those small steps forward. And when things get tough, know that God is with you, guiding you every step of the way. For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The evening was quiet, peaceful, and the world seemed to slow down around them. In that stillness, John realized that this was what life was really about, the moments of connection, the moments of quiet reflection, the moments of faith. As they stood up to leave, Sarah turned to him and said, "Thanks, John. I think I needed someone to remind me that it's okay to take things slow." John smiled. It's all about trust. Trust that God will guide you, even when the road is hard. As he walked home that night, John felt a deep sense of peace. He had no idea where his journey would lead next, but he knew that he was no longer walking alone. The world around him might continue to move at its frantic pace, but he had found something that couldn't be taken away, a purpose, a peace, and a trust in something greater than himself. And that was enough for now. As time passed, John's life began to take shape in a way he hadn't anticipated. The questions, doubts, and struggles that had once consumed him were still there, but they no longer had the same power over him. He had learned to navigate them with faith, steadily, quietly, and with a deep sense of trust that God was leading him in ways he couldn't always see, but knew were right for him. Work had become less of a source of stress and more of an opportunity to live out his values. He had found joy in his job, not because of promotions or accolades, but because he was doing work that felt meaningful. His colleagues had noticed the change in him. He wasn't as driven by the need to prove himself anymore. Instead, he showed up with a steady presence, focused on doing good work and being kind to others. It wasn't always easy, especially in a competitive environment, but John had learned that his worth wasn't tied to his job title or salary, it was tied to the way he lived each day with integrity. One evening, as John was walking home from work, he found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. The road had not always been clear, and the path had been full of twists and turns, but he now saw the beauty in the unpredictability. He had found a life that was rich with purpose, not defined by worldly measures, but by faith, kindness, and an unwavering belief that God was guiding him through it all. When John returned to his apartment that night, he sat down in his favorite chair and picked up his Bible. He had come to see the scriptures not just as words on a page, but as a source of strength, guidance, and comfort. As he read the verses, he felt a deep connection to the words. The stories, the teachings, the wisdom, it all resonated with him in a way it never had before. And in that quiet moment, John felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. His life was far from perfect, but it was exactly what he needed. The peace he had found in living authentically, in trusting God, was more valuable than any achievement or recognition he had once sought. The journey had taught him that happiness wasn't something to be chased, it was something to be embraced, right where he was. The phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, asking if they could meet for coffee. She had been on her own journey of faith, and John had been honored to walk alongside her, offering guidance when he could. She had made great strides in understanding her own purpose, but still faced challenges. As John responded, he smiled, knowing that the journey was never a solitary one. Faith wasn't just about individual growth, it was about sharing that growth with others, encouraging them along the way. As he met Sarah in the cafe the next morning, John noticed the change in her as well. She looked more at peace, more settled in her own skin. She had stopped chasing the approval of others, and instead, had started living her life with confidence in her own beliefs. "I'm still figuring things out," Sarah said with a laugh, "but I think I'm finally on the right path." John smiled. That's the thing about faith. It's not about having all the answers, it's about trusting that you're where you need to be, even when things are unclear. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned that. It's not about having everything figured out right away. It's about taking each step, trusting the process." The two of them sat in silence for a few moments, content in the understanding they shared. They didn't need to speak to know that they were both on a journey, one that was full of uncertainty, but also full of hope. John left the cafe that morning feeling more fulfilled than ever. His path was far from over, but he had come so far. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more doubts, more struggles, and more questions, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had learned that faith wasn't a magic fix to life's problems, it was a constant source of strength that allowed him to face them with courage, peace, and trust. The world around him continued to move at its usual pace, but John had found his own rhythm. It wasn't fast or flashy, but it was steady and true. He had learned that success wasn't measured by the world's standards, but by how well he lived his values, how deeply he connected with others, and how faithfully he trusted in God's plan. And with that, John realized that he didn't need to have everything figured out. The journey itself, the ups and downs, the highs and lows, was what made life rich. He was exactly where he needed to be, and that was enough. As he walked forward, he knew that with faith in his heart and trust in God, he was ready for whatever came next. And so, John's story continued, one step at a time, full of faith, full of trust, and full of the quiet peace that came from living a life aligned with his beliefs. Whatever the future held, he knew he was not alone. And with that, he was content.